1493 for young people, From Columbus's Voyage to Globalization by Charles C. Mann, and it's adapted by Rebecca Steffoff. We're going to page through these books. You can see here's your chapters, which you can look at in your hardcover. There's a map that doesn't look that great, but I'll share it with you on a colored copy. Introduction to this about this book. So the introduction just sort of tells you kind of what you're going to read, what you can expect. A lot of times how the author got the inspiration. They're always worthwhile reading. It kind of sets the stage for your brain to understand what you're going to read. This book is about the whole world, but it began in a single garden. More than 20 years ago, I saw a news article about local college students who had grown 100 different kinds of tomato. Visitors were welcome to come take a look at their work. Because I liked tomatoes, I decided to drop by with my 8-year-old son. When we arrived at the college greenhouse, I was amazed. I'd never seen tomatoes in so many different sizes, shapes, and colors. A student offered us samples. One alarmingly lumpy tomato was the color of an old brick, with a broad greenish-black patch around the stem. Its taste was so intense that it jolted my mouth awake. Its name, the student said, was Black from Tula. It was an heirloom tomato, an old variety. It had been developed in the 19th century in Ukraine, south of Russia. I thought tomatoes came from Mexico, I said. What are they doing breeding them in Ukraine? The student gave me a catalog of heirloom seeds for tomatoes, chili peppers, and beans, the kind of beans in Chile, not green ones. All three of these crops originated in the Americas, but the catalog showed many varieties that came from overseas: Japanese tomatoes, Italian peppers, beans from the Congo. Wanting more of those strange but tasty tomatoes, I ordered some seeds, sprouted them in plastic containers, and stuck the seedlings in a garden, something I'd never done before. My question to the student had been off the mark, as I discovered when I did some research. Tomatoes probably originated not in Mexico, but in the Andes Mountains of South America. Wild tomato species that still grow there are small, and only one is barely edible. The real mystery is not how tomatoes ended up in Ukraine or Japan, but how the ancestors of today's tomatoes journeyed from South America to Mexico, where plant breeders made the fruits bigger, redder, and most importantly, more edible. Why carry useless wild tomatoes for thousands of miles? Why hadn't South Americans learned to use the tomato? How had people in Mexico gone about changing the plant to meet their needs? These questions touch on a long-standing interest of mine, the original inhabitants of the Americas. As a reporter for the journal Science, I had spoken with researchers about new findings on the size and advanced development of long ago native societies in the Americas. Eventually, I wrote 1491, a book about the history of the Americas before Christopher Columbus's arrival in 1492. The tomatoes in my garden carried a little of that history and their DNA. After Columbus. My tomatoes also carried some of the history after Columbus. Beginning in the 16th century, Europeans took tomatoes around the world. After convincing themselves that the strange red blobs were not poisonous, farmers planted them from Africa to Asia. In a small way, the plant had a cultural impact everywhere it was sown. Sometimes the impact was not so small. It's almost impossible to imagine southern Italy without tomato sauce. Still, I didn't grasp that the transplants, such as the tomatoes, might have played a role beyond the dinner plate until I came across a paperback titled Ecological Imperialism by a geographer and history named Alfred Crosby. Wondering about what the title could refer to, I picked up the book. The first sentence seemed to jump off the page. European immigrants and their descendants are all over the place, which requires an explanation. So we've been studying this word, ecological, which is about the science of the environment, or about living things in relationship to each other. Imperialism is aggressive authority over others. So I guess that book is about how imported plants impose their own strength over other plants and animals too. Exactly. Most Africans live in Africa, most Asians in Asia, and most Native Americans in the Americas. People of European descent, though, are thick on the ground in distant realms such as Australia, the Americas, and southern Africa. They are successful transplants. But why? It is as much of a puzzle as the tomatoes in Ukraine. Right here, you'll see in these annotated texts, I kind of summarize the paragraph for you, so you can rely on that too. Historians used to explain Europe's spread across the globe in terms of European superiority. They argued that Europeans simply had better social systems, science, ships, or weaponry than the cultures whose lands they conquered and colonized. Yet Crosby argued that, in the long run, Europe's most important advantage was biological. European ships that sailed from continent to continent carried not just people, but plants and animals as well, sometimes on purpose, sometimes accidentally. After Columbus, ecosystems that had been separate for ages suddenly met and mixed in a process Crosby called the Columbian Exchange. The exchange took corn, maize to Africa, sweet potatoes to East Asia, horses and apples to the Americas, and rhubarb and eucalyptus to Europe. It also swapped around many insects, grasses, bacteria, and viruses. The people who caused the Columbian Exchange did not fully understand or control what they were doing, but the exchange let Europeans transform much of the world. They turned the Americas, Asia, and to a lesser extent Africa, into ecological versions of Europe. This is a very big idea right here. They created new landscapes that Europeans could use comfortably, sometimes more comfortably than the people who had originally lived there. Crosby claimed that this ecological transformation gave the British, Dutch, French, and Spanish and Portuguese the edge they needed to win their overseas empires. Crosby's books helped give rise to a new field of study, environmental history. Another new field, Atlantic studies, looked at the many important interactions among the cultures that border the Atlantic Ocean. The same approach is being taken with the Pacific Ocean. Researchers in these fields have been putting together a new picture of how our modern interconnected civilization came into being. Today we use the term globalization for the growing web of connections between economies and cultures around the planet. Globalization got started when 16th century Europeans wanted to join the thriving trade of Asia. The desire led to the voyages of Columbus and others like him. By the 19th century, almost instantly in biological terms, the economic trade system had turned the globe into a single biological system. Creating the system helped Europe seize political power for several centuries, which shaped today's world. Our ancestors did not have the internet, air travel, genetically modified crops, or computerized international stock exchange. Still, when we read accounts of how the world market was created, we hear echoes of today's disputes about globalization, which has brought enormous economic gains and ecological and social upheaval. What happened after Columbus, new research says, was nothing less than the forming of a single new world from the collision of two old worlds. 3 if you count Africa as separate from Eurasia. Columbus's voyage did not mark the discovery of a new world. It marked the creation of the new world in which we now live. How that world was created is the subject of this book. What this book is not. Do not expect a complete survey of the roots of the modern world system. The subject is too big for any single book. Some parts of the world I skip entirely. Some important events are barely mentioned. Instead, in this book, I concentrate on areas that seem to me to be especially important, well documented, and interesting. The story unfolds in 5 parts, with 2 chapters in each part. Part 1 begins with Columbus and shows how his voyage and other voyages that established the trade between shows how his voyage and other voyages that established trade between Europe and Asia gave birth to a new era in the history of life. The biological world became united for the first time in hundreds of millions of years. The human world of trade, colonization, resource use became united as well. Parts 2 and 3 lay out the halves of the Columbian Exchange, the separate but linked exchanges across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Part 2 looks at the exchanges that developed across the Atlantic. The focus is on the first global craze for new products and on the arrival of a new and deadly disease that helped shape African slavery in the Americas. Part 3 shifts the focus to the Pacific, where the era of globalization began with massive shipments of silver from South America to China. Wealth was not the only thing transplanted to China, however. The ecological part of the Columbian Exchange altered the course of Chinese history. Part 4 shows the role of Columbian Exchange in two revolutions, the Agricultural Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. Two plant species, each transplanted to new parts of the world, fueled those revolutions and helped the West emerge as a controlling power in the world. In Part 5, I pick up a theme from Part 2 and examine what, in human terms, was the most significant exchange of all, the slave trade. This discussion focuses on how slavery worked and its later effects, rather on the moral arguments against it. Today, slavery is banned in every nation. Readers don't need me to tell them that buying and selling human beings is wrong. Yet not many people today understand how widespread slavery was in the past, or how many changes it created around the world. And our new image of the past is of a busy, interconnected place driven by ecology and economics. It may be startling to people who, like me, were brought up on tales of heroic navigators, brilliant inventors, and empires won by technological or political superiority. Yet there is a grandeur here, too, in this view of the past. It reminds us that every place has played a part in the human story, and that all of us are embedded in the larger, complex process of life on this planet. Just take a minute to think of that. Back to the garden. As I write these words, it's a warm August day. Yesterday, my family picked the first tomatoes from our garden, the garden that has replaced the tomato patch I planted after visiting college greenhouses decades ago. After I planted those first seeds from the catalog, it didn't take me long to discover why so many people love puttering in gardens. Messing around with the tomatoes felt like building a fort as a child. I was creating a refuge from the world and a place of my own in that world. Kneeling in the dirt, I was making a small landscape, the one that had the comfortable and comforting and timeless words like home. To biologists, this must seem like poppycock. My tomato patch has housed basil, eggplant, bell peppers, kale, chard, several types of lettuce, greens, and a few marigolds. None of these species originated within 1,000 miles of my garden, nor did the corn or tobacco grown on nearby farms. Equally alien are my neighbors' cows, horses, and barn cats. My garden is a biological record of past human wanderings and exchange. Ever since Columbus, the world has seen groups of people taking plants, animals, goods, and ideas from other groups and making them their own, adapting and twisting the new things to fit their own needs. Every place on Earth's surface, except possibly scraps of Antarctica, has been changed by this process. For the 5 centuries now, the crash and chaos of constant connection has been our home condition. My garden, with its parade of exotic plants, is a small example. How did tomatoes get to Ukraine anyway? This book represents, long after I first asked the question, my best efforts to find out. And here's a picture of, I believe, Irish boys in the potato fields in Ireland.